I think our work today does pick up where Bill left off in terms of having a conversation about just doing some examination of our oh, sorry about that. Doing an examination of our our history as a nation, and then doing the task of theology as Christians, right? To begin to think about where the history of our country and our current reality in regards to race and racism and making change in our country meet up. So
it might be an interesting fact to know that there was a demonstration for Black Lives Matter on Michigan Avenue just about an hour ago.
Oh, great. Wow.
And I would say there were more policemen than there were demonstrators.
Oh, really? It was a
yeah.
tonight.
Well, maybe 100 people, maybe 200, and maybe 210 policemen, mostly on bicycles.
So, I mean, I think, so that points to the fact that this continues to be work that is important and part of our kind of collective
responsibility.
Yeah, responsibility. So we are looking, let me see if I can get, I'm doing this all wrong, sorry. No.
Is that a book too?
So we are working today with this book by James Cone that's called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And so I kind of have two introductions before we get into the book. The first introduction is, obviously this is going to be a book talking about the cross, and it's also a book talking about lynching trees, a history of lynching in America. So we have this ancient context, right? 2,000 years ago, they put him, Jesus of Nazareth, to death by hanging on a tree. So we have the cross in its context, and then we also have the lynching tree. You probably won't be able to read this text, but it comes from a newspaper in 1930. It says, hundreds of Kodaks clicked all morning long at the scene of the lynching. People in automobiles and carriages came from miles around to view the corpse dangling from the end of a rope. Picture card photographers installed a portable printing plant at the bridge and reaped a harvest in selling the postcard showing a photograph of a lynched Black man. Women and children were there by the score. At a number of country schools, the day's routine was delayed until boy and girl pupils could get back from viewing the lynched man. So that's from Fayette County. So that is a picture of the context of lynching in America. And so by way of trigger warnings, I have one image of Jesus on the cross and a piece of art from the 1500s. And I'm choosing not to show any images of the lynching tree, particularly of lynchings, of folks who have died, in part because of this context, right? So there was this manufacturing of printables of lynchings as a way of kind of showing white power and for white audiences to share with their friends postcards of their experience of Black death. And so kind of in protest against that action, I'm not going to show any pictures of lynchings. There are, likely contexts where a picture of a lynching is appropriate to show, but kind of, speaking against that white context, I won't show any images of lynchings. And then I kind of want to put that in conversation with the death of Ahmaud Arbery. Ahmaud Arbery's death happened in the winter time, but those who killed him were not accused, or his death was not taken seriously until the spring, when video evidence was brought forward. And so if you saw the assignment for today, it was to also watch this film called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, a Requiem for Ahmaud Arbery. It was produced by Trinity United Church of Christ and Otis Moss, their pastor. And at the very beginning of that, he says about Ahmaud, another life taken, another public lynching, another act of recorded Black death, weekly broadcasts of Black bodies falling to the ground, a primetime series we hope will be canceled from the collective conscience of America's citizenry. So he's pointing to the fact that the death of Black men and women is constant enough that it's as if it's a primetime series. And in his film, he connects the lynching tree to our current American situation. So this film was made before the death of George Floyd, but the death of George Floyd was a catalyst to get us in conversation about race in America and about what it means to be an anti-racist church. So I just want to put those two things in conversation: the prominence of photographs of lynchings in the early 1900s as a way for white people, white audiences to celebrate lynchings, and then now the ways in which video evidence might be hidden or kept quiet or not brought forward for some time, as in the case of Ahmaud. And how those two things are a little bit in tension with each other. So I bring those kind of together at the beginning as kind of context about the cross and the lynching tree. So this is in memory of Ahmaud Arbery and the long litany of Black men and women whose deaths escape justice when there is no evidence of violence. The other quote from Otis Moss from his film, The Requiem for Ahmaud Arbery, is, "The death of Ahmaud Arbery stands in a historical pattern of behavior that calls every American to an unexamined history of our nation." So I think, I think that's one of the reasons why we're doing this today, right? Is because of the death of Ahmaud Arbery. And so I just hold those things in tension. So that's the first introduction. The second introduction would be kind of contextualizing who I am and who we are as we look at the cross and the lynching tree. And so I'll do this just by way of adding a second layer of tension. I was born in 1982 in Midland, Michigan, which is a town that kind of exists right now in large relationship to Dow Chemical. So that's why my family was there. My dad was working at Dow Chemical. My mom was born in Crawfordsville, Indiana. She was the first person in her family to receive a college education. And I think one of the reasons that my mom was able to go to college was because of the ways that my grandfather benefited from the GI Bill upon return from World War II. So if you want to look more into kind of the history of race in America, one of the places that I found to be really inspirational and helpful was learning about the GI Bill. And I say inspirational in terms of it helped me reframe and understand what white privilege looks like. The GI Bill was almost entirely able to be used by those returning from the war who were white, and was almost exclusively never something available to those who were Black who were returning from the war. So if you want to think a little bit more about I don't know, what it means to be white, what it means to be Black in America, that's kind of one of the more recent places where structural racism is part of our history. My dad was born in near Delphi, Indiana. He was the first to get a PhD in his family. And he grew up, this photo of me and my son is at the farm where my dad grew up. So in the background, you can see the little farmhouse. That land was signed over to our family in 1832 from Andrew Jackson as part of the Indian Removals Act. So I note both of those things, the GI Bill and the Indian Removals Act, as kind of my two places where I've thought about and learned about what it means to be white, and kind of seen my own life history complicated by the structures of race in America. So so that's kind of my history. And then I went to high school in Carmel, Indiana, where at the time the population was 92% white. And if you know anything about redlining or white flight, you'll probably know that it's probably not an accident that Carmel was 92% white at the time. Just up the street from my high school was a golf course called Hanging Tree. It was a popular place to golf nearby, and there was a noose that was hung at the 16th hole. It was not renamed until 2004. And it's actually really hard to find much information about it being called Hanging Tree. And I think that it's possible the golf course has paid a lot of money to keep that off the front page of Google. And then Carmel it's north of Indianapolis, but then if you go another hour north of Carmel, where I grew up, you'll get to this town called Marion, Indiana, where a 1930 lynching, the last lynching in Indiana, was made famous by Billie Holiday's song Strange Fruit. And so I didn't know about that until a couple years ago. And there's a really, if you send me a note, I'll forward you this really beautifully done history of Billie Holiday and of that lynching that really is eye-opening if you want to know more about that. So here's what she says, and it's actually from a poem that someone else wrote, but she says, "Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees, pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop." So this book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, makes me ask a big question, right? What do I need to do right now in the next week, month, year, as a white Christian, as a parent to a young white child, and as a pastor to a mostly white church in the midst of this renewed hope for dismantling racism? I hope this conversation is part of that. it makes us ask as a church, what do we need to do now as a mostly white church in the midst of a renewed hope for dismantling racism in America, and in the midst of a pandemic that disproportionately impacts people of color, right? So, even the format of this conversation kind of pushes us to think about that, the pandemic context. So this is a multi-layered kind of thing. What do we need to do as a mostly white church to prevent more unjust deaths of Black men and women in the world? So that was a long introduction, but I think we'll get through James Cone with enough time to have a little bit of conversation around it too. This is James Cone. He died 2 years ago. He was born in Bearden, Arkansas. So you can see his hometown's there at the bottom. And you drive north in Little Rock out to Memphis and then straight north to Chicago. He grew up at this Macedonia AME church. And he says this about Bearden, Arkansas, where he grew up. 2 things happened to me in Bearden. I encountered the harsh realities of white injustice that were inflicted daily upon the Black community, and I was given a faith that sustained my personhood and dignity in spite of white people's brutality. The dual reality of white injustice and Black faith as a part of the structure of life created a tension in my being that has not been resolved. So he wrote that in 1986. I would wonder how he felt about that later in his life. But I bet he held that for a long time. And he said, Bearden is important because it happened to be the geological context in which the ugliness of racism was clearly revealed to me, and I knew that I had to struggle against it. So one of the things that, I think one of the reasons that I start with kind of a little bit about myself and about what it means for me to be a white person is because I think it's important for us to explore for ourselves that geographical context in which, for us, the ugliness of racism is clearly revealed, right? Did you learn that as a child? Did you learn that as a teenager? Did you learn that as a young adult? Did you have your understanding of race and racism turned upside down this summer, right? I think, there's always a geographical context where we learn about racism and what it is. So this is a map of Arkansas. This is from the Equal Justice Initiative, which is by Brian Stevenson. He wrote a book called Just Mercy, and then most recently opened the it's like a lynching museum in now I'm forgetting what town it is that it's in, but it'll come to me. So this is from that from the Equal Justice Initiative, and there's a map of lynchings in America. So he mapped out all the lynchings in America and has a deep database and a very storied history behind each person, as much as can be found. So in the county where James Cone was born and raised, there were 11 reported lynchings between 1877 and 1950. So lynchings that went on into the first, 10 years of James Cone's life. And there were 492 lynchings in Arkansas, and about 5,000 across America in that time. So that is just kind of some context about why he might have written a book about the cross and the lynching tree. So he went he went to these two colleges that were historically Black universities, and then headed north to Chicago, to Evanston, to Garrett Theological Seminary. So he was here in our neck of the woods in the 60s. He got a PhD from Northwestern University as ordained pastor in the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal. He was the first Black PhD candidate at Garrett, and then he ended up getting his PhD from Northwestern, and taught at Union Seminary in New York City from 1969 on. He wrote a number of famous books. Black Theology of Liberation was probably the one that I found most challenging in seminary, and so you'll see Martin Luther King and Malcolm here in a minute. He wrote this book, Martin and Malcolm and America, a Dream or a Nightmare, as in the 90s. And I loved this story that he told about kind of the context of his first book. He said, 2 months after Martin Luther King's assassination, from my brother's church in Little Rock, Arkansas, it seemed as if a transcendent voice were speaking to me through the scriptures and the medium of African American history and culture, reminding me that God's liberation for the poor is the primary theme of the gospel. And for me, what sticks out about that is that it was Martin Luther King Jr.'s death that sparked his theological imagination and this transcendent experience. And for Martin Luther King, it was the death of Emmett Till. So, it just makes me wonder in some big ways what theology is shifting and changing, and who is thinking about this now, deepening this conversation now. So here's his thesis for The Cross and the Lynching Tree, that both the cross and the lynching tree were symbols of terror, instruments of torture and execution reserved primarily for slaves, criminals, and insurrectionists, the lowest in society. So that's where he starts. And it shouldn't be a surprise. That's the title of his book. They were both symbols of terror, instruments of torture and execution reserved primarily for slaves and criminals. So like I said, there were 5,000 Black men and women. The way James Cone writes it, between 1880 and 1940, white Christians lynched nearly 5,000 Black men and women in a manner with obvious echoes of the Roman crucifixion, yet these Christians, in quotations, did not see the irony or contradictions of their actions, which is a very convicting statement about what it means to be a white Christian in America. This is a picture from the Lynching Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and let me find the quote. I can't read this quote here without the note. So this is not part of James Cone. This is from the Lynching Museum. It says here, for the hanged, the beaten, the shot, the drowned, and the burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember with hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice, with courage, because peace requires bravery, with persistence, because justice is a constant struggle, with faith, because we shall overcome. And the lynching museum has one of these. You can see these hanging pieces of metal. They're about 6 feet tall, and they represent someone who was lynched. And if you go to this museum, the place where you start walking into the museum, those 6 foot tall pieces of metal are right at eye level. So you kind of walk among them. And then by the time you get down to where this quote is on the wall, you're under them, you're standing under them, and you start to kind of feel the weight of the history of lynching in America in kind of a tangible way as you walk among these men and women who died. So James Cone says that when he reads theology, when he reads Christian historians talking about the context of Jesus's death, that he hears lynching there. So this is a quote from Paula Fredrickson, a New Testament scholar, from her book, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And so having thought a little bit about what lynching was in America, listen to this about crucifixion. She said, crucifixion was a Roman form of public service announcement. Do not engage in sedition as this person has, or your fate will be similar. The point of the exercise was not the death of the offender as such, but getting the attention of those watching. Crucifixion is first and foremost an address to an audience. First and foremost, addressed to an audience. So you can think of the death of Emmett Till, and he was accused of whistling at a white woman, right? The point of his death, James Cone is saying, was not his death as such, but to get the attention of those watching. So lynching and crucifixion match one another in form and function. Often stripped, often paraded, often mocked, often whipped, often pierced, often derided, often spat upon, often tortured for hours, often jeered at by a crowd. So you can think of that crowd from the thing that I read at the very beginning about the photographers and the crowd gathered. And the crowd watching Jesus's crucifixion. So here's the Bible, a text that we are familiar with. We read it every spring. Bill, will you read this? Are you there?
Yep, on mute. As the soldiers led Jesus away, they see Simon of Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to the women, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children." 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, They crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they were doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots.
So we see a lot of those markers of the cross in our lynching story. Jeered at, tortured for hours, spat upon, casting lots. One of the stories of lynchings talks about the way a man's body was torn apart and his body parts were sold. So, for in the context of lynching, it was not just the dividing up of his clothes by casting lots, but it was the dividing up of knuckles and body parts. So one of the things that James Cone talks about at length is the ways in which white theologians in the 20th century focused on the cross and yet never made this connection between the cross and the lynching tree. But he does highlight some ways in which Black artists make that connection. So this is from civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson. He is the author of the song "Lift Every Voice and Sing," which we had in worship a couple weeks ago. It is considered the African American national anthem, and he was part of the Dyer anti-lynching bill. He worked to pass that and was a participant in civil rights activism in the early 1900s. So he writes, "Up Golgotha's rugged road, I see my Jesus go. I see him sink beneath the load. I see my drooping Jesus sink. And then they laid hold on Simon, Black Simon, yes, Black Simon. They put the cross on Simon, and Simon bore the cross." So that's this Simon of Cyrene who's mentioned in this reading of Jesus's death from Luke 23. And you see it again, this identification with Simon as a Black man who carried the cross. This is from Harlem Renaissance poet County Cullen, who was the author of a book called "The Black Christ and Other Poems." He writes, "That twisted, tortured thing hung from a tree, swart victim of a Newark Calvary. Yea, he helped Christ up Golgotha's track, that Simon who did not deny was Black." So this identification of that character who carries Jesus's cross as a Black man who knows about the lynching tree. These two things kind of poetically intertwined. So here is Niebuhr, who James Cone leans heavily upon to talk about what a theology of the cross means, but who James Cone criticizes as someone who still is embedded in the context of white supremacy, or at least is influenced enough by being a white man in America that he can't quite see this connection. So Niebuhr says, "I believe that God came in the form of a little child born to humble parents in a manger. This life in the manger ended up on the cross. And if we might end there, aka on the cross, and we might end there, aka on the cross, if we really emulated it." So he's saying that being a Christian is risky, right? It's if we are to follow God and emulate Christ, it might be life risking. And so, you see this throughout Scripture. God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things that are mighty. The first will be last, and the last will be first. And Niebuhr again, the Christian faith is centered in the one who was born in a manger and died on the cross. The Christian knows that the cross is the truth. In that standard, the Christian sees ultimately the success of what the world calls failure and the failure of what the world calls success. So as white Christians, we've heard a lot from this guy. His theological orientation about the gospel being the world turned upside down, and this idea that the cross is the truth, and that that we might, a guy who encouraged us to follow Christ and even to risk our lives the way Christ did, has influenced us, Reinhold Niebuhr, over and over and over again. If you were to do a survey of Bill Evertsberg's sermons, you would hear him 30% of the time, and he's a major influence on American Christendom, and on James Cone, right? As a 20th century theologian, trained in the gospel, this is who he studied, and so he's calling him to account, and saying, "Why didn't you see me as a Black man who was living in fear under the power of lynching in America?" So James Cone's thesis is another way. His thesis is said over and over again throughout his book. Until we can see the cross and the lynching tree together, until we can identify with Christ as a re-crucified Black body hanging from a lynching tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America, and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. So he's telling us, even this book was published in 2011, I think, and it's 2011. He's telling us the same thing that we need to hear today, right? I kind of wonder if, what he would say if he were alive today, right? What he would be telling us about the death of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. What would he be telling us as Christians? What would he be calling us to do? Here, Otis Moss maybe is the person picking up the torch, right? And carrying this theology into the next decades. In his film, he says, "We, the Black community, are by nature a people of resistance. Our faith is and was a faith of resistance. We saw Jesus not as a European figure given to us by missionaries, but as a dark-skinned Jew who stood on the side of the oppressed." Jesus was for us, the Black community, and with us, and knew the heartache of loved ones being brutalized by occupying forces. So I think Otis Moss III is somebody to listen to this year. He's a pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ, which is at 95th and Dan Ryan. He was born in 1970, so he was born into this legacy of James Cone. James Cone published his first book in 1969, and so he would have read read James Cone from the first time he opened a theology book. And Otis Moss III's father was co-pastor with Martin Luther King Jr.'s father at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. So he would have been reading theology probably at a young age as well. So this is the core question of this book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And I think Otis Moss is trying to answer that question too. If God loves Black people, why then do we suffer so much? That was my question as a child. That is still my question now. So he's saying, James Cone is saying that in 2011. And I think Otis Moss is saying it today. So Christianity for the Black community and for the white community, for all of us together as Christians, is a theology of liberation. The Christian gospel is God's message of liberation in an unredeemed and tortured world. And I believe we can participate in that, right? Last week's critique of what it means to be white in America was, it brings us to that place of self-reflection. And I think that James Cone takes us to that next step of liberation, right? The Christian gospel is God's message of liberation in an unredeemed and tortured world. There's a whole bunch of other stuff about the transcendent experience of God. I think I'm gonna skip it because I want to hear from you guys. Even though talking about the transcendent is my favorite thing. So last thing I'll say, and then I want to hear what you guys are thinking. I was Black before I was Christian, he says. So is that true for me? Was I white before I was Christian? Is that true? Is that true for any of us? How does my faith in Jesus Christ, who died on the cross, become a catalyst for anti-racist action? James Cone has a lot of hope for us, that it's possible, that the gospel is empowering. I believe the cross placed alongside the lynching tree can help us see Jesus in America in a new light and thereby empower people who claim to follow Jesus to take a stand against white supremacy and every kind of justice. So I'll leave it here on this little piece of hope, and then I want to hear what you guys think, reactions, hopes, dreams, questions. That's a lot.
Well, I'll jump in, and if you haven't watched Reverend Otis's sermon, it's a must. You just have to watch that. And it's about 22 minutes long. And this phrase jumped out at me, and I had to stop and go back and hear it. And he stated, "We have been hypnotized by an Americanized form of capitalism that masquerades as Christianity." And that just stopped me, because when I thought about it, I said, wow, I think that's one of the truest things that I've heard in the last 50 years of my life. And, you've got to hear, as a white person, you can't get into the skin of a Black person. But the only way you can do that is hear these powerful speakers that reiterate the pain and terror that our Black brothers and sisters have lived under, not only for 400 years of our history, but even further back. They were the slaves in Egypt. They were And they were like the slave race for civilization for 5,000 years.
Hmm.
So, on the other hand, the hopeful thing is that this has been brought to our consciousness in a very direct way. Emmett Till, all of you must remember when his mother had an open casket funeral here in Chicago and told the embalmers, don't touch him. And they had a 3-day viewing of his body, which was mangled, his face was beaten into a pulp. And her courage to do that, I mean, that just, to me, shows the spirit of Jesus within a human being, to do something, to make a statement, which led to Rosa Parks saying, to hell with it, I'm not going to sit at the back of the bus. I mean, that's just, that is pivotal, where one incident just ignites a movement. So, Katie, this has just been a wonderful particular chapter, and I'd have to recommend everybody to. It's on YouTube. It's you'll just fall in love with this guy. And I like everything he says, but we're so isolated here on the North Shore. It's just it's unbelievable. Thank you.
What else? Reactions?
Does Dr. Cohn comment on how that many white Christians could lynch people and not see a connection to the crucifixion? I mean, are they actively avoiding the connection, or, I mean, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think there seems to be a lot of one of the things that happens, and you hear this in Emmett Till, is this protection of white women, right? So the white Christian husband in the South in the 1930s is going to say, well, I needed to participate in that lynching in order to protect the women that I love, right? And so there was this justification that surrounded all of it, that was based on fear of Black bodies. That is this kind of this
Like Amy Cooper.
thing that happens over history. This fear of Black bodies. I'm trying to think of where you can read about that. It's in a couple of different places, but I'll send you a note. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hillary, I see you thinking.
I am thinking. Yeah, still thinking.
You don't have no pressure.
This is like school. I feel like I got called out.
No, sorry.
That's okay. I appreciate.
Up to you, Hillary. I'll try to answer Dana's question from my perspective.
Thank you.
I think the key philosophical move, Dana, to permit white people first to enslave an entire race, and then when they are no longer enslaved, to kill them on lynching trees, is you just don't consider them to be human. So they have the same moral status or standing as cattle do. We slaughter cows, and we can slaughter people who aren't human. I think that's the key move, and that in their own mind, that's how a white Christian would justify the taking of a Black life.
So then you don't see it as, you don't see the parallel to the crucifixion because they're not human.
Right.
Jesus was human.
They're a
Right.
side of beef. They're monkeys in the African jungle, and that was what allowed them to cart them over and to lose half of a load in a slave ship.
one of the places to see more about that is the PBS series called Race. They talk about kind of the way that science at the time was, especially in the late 1800s, was trying to claim that Black bodies were so different from white bodies that that there was a scientific difference. And so you see that in it still happens in our racial conscience when you hear people say things about Black men or women being better athletes, for example. So that comment comes from this history of science in which the legacy of slavery and the creation of race in America made white people, us, ask questions of the legitimacy of that system, and therefore take our scientific exploration down this dark path of trying to prove that our human bodies were different. And that PBS series called Race in America has a section on the history of science and race.
Katie,
Go ahead.
Katie, may I add something about Sunday school and the dehumanization?
Yeah.
So one of the papers that I did as a Christian educator, I attended Garrett as well, like James Cone, was to compare the Sunday school materials for white children in the 1800s and enslaved Black children. There were actually booklets that they used for the instruction of both white and Black children. And the white children received education that focused primarily on being made in the image of God. And it was striking to compare the two, because the instruction for Black children talked much more about obedience and being in service to God. And so there was a very striking difference, which I think, the Sunday school arose and became popular throughout the 1800s, and this sort of thinking was embedded in our teaching. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there were slave Bibles that left out the story of the Exodus as well. So there's sort of, in the Christian tradition, there are very unfortunate places where we've reinforced that dehumanization.
Wow, thank you.
If I might add, I love Reverend Otis when he said, well, obviously Jesus was a brown man. He was not a white man. As Palestinians, Bill and the rest of us has been there. They're a brown people, not a white people. And so then I've been in the Netherlands, and I've looked at all those wonderful religious paintings, and Jesus is as white can be. So, but I mean that's understandable. We see Jesus as our. There was a church up there in Nazareth. I think it was Nazareth. In the outer walkway, they had collected paintings from around the world of Mother Mary and the baby Jesus. And the one from Africa was Black. The one from China, Mary and Jesus were Asian. And I just thought that was one of the most beautiful demonstrations of how we all see him or her in our own culture. So, but
Yeah. Marilyn?
I sometimes have worshiped at Mike Flager's church, St. Sabina's on the south side.
Yeah.
And you go in there and there's a huge cross, and Jesus on that cross is Black. And the first time I saw it, it has a stunning effect on one to see that. And I think last week somebody said about the fact that we don't have many Blacks in our churches, and that's true of my church as well, even though I'm in the city of Chicago. But when you worship at St. Sabina's or in St. Agatha, some of these other churches, the worship is so different. You know, they are so involved. St. Sabina's, the Mass is 3 hours. I mean, that's it. And, you know, we often pride ourselves on who could do the half-hour, you know, service in our church. When actually, our church is about an hour and a half, so we're getting up there. But I think that we have to really, it's a wonderful experience to go into an African-American church, to be a minority, to be part of their service and their praying, and also makes me realize they would not be too pleased with how we worship in most of our churches. It would not be, how, you know, what speaks to them.
Mm.
Basically, we should recall that Jesus encouraged us to worship God in the manner that we seem fitting. So, you know, to me, we should welcome all manner of ways of worshiping God. And we should feel a part of that because we are worshiping the same God.
I think that question, though, of why 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is, as Martin Luther King pointed out, right, still the most segregated hour of our week. And what that means to us, and what we want to do in response to that, and how as a church we might I don't know, do some of that internal work, and then think about what actions we need to take next as a congregation. And any other final thoughts on James Cone?
Katie,
Yeah.
do you know any successful churches where there's integration, you know, both black and white worshiping side by side, that are successful and what they look like?
I think, I mean, the church that the church my brother serves is a biracial church, and they're very attentive to you know, what that means for them, and how they make decisions and balance their leadership, and listen to all voices and participate in anti-racist work. I know other churches like Urban Village Church that are doing a good job of thinking about that as well, and, you know, building a racially diverse staff. And I mean, they started in 2005, so they maybe started with a lens that was different, but I don't know what their racial makeup of their congregation is. Bill, maybe you know one or two.
Well, the church that popped into my mind was Riverside Church near Columbia University on the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
Yeah.
That's a nice, healthy mix of black and white. They kind of trade back and forth having white and black pastors, but it's a very, very difficult. It's a very tense church. And they're always fighting about whether the pastor is too white or too black. But it is a nice model for us, for all of us.
It's interesting to me, though, too. It's even bigger than the black-white segregation of churches. When I think about the Koreans having their own churches, even within the Presbyterian Church, they'll have a Korean Presbyterian church because they don't want to worship with the white Presbyterians. And then there's the, you know, the Chinese, and it's just, there's so many different segregations within Christianity. I think it's even bigger than just the black-white issue. I know our focus tonight is the black-white, but you know, it kind of goes to that people feeling comfortable with their own kind of thing. And we've got to learn that, you know, to branch out and embrace others. But I think it's a bigger issue.
Yeah. There's a lot to do with culture and history and yeah, worship is a very vulnerable, intimate thing to participate in.
Katie, where is your brother's church, and how big a geographic area does it draw on?
He's in Morgan Park. So Morgan Park was it's a suburb of Chicago that was pretty vocal during the redlining to not participate in that. There were there was a community of, as I understand it, a community of white and black neighbors who said that they were not going to participate in, you know, white flight, and they were going to stay and build intentional community. So the church has been, you know, working toward that for a long time, and it's, you know, it's a very small church, but they do a good job.
Is it a Presbyterian church?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where I did my field site study when I was a pastor, or when I was a student at McCormick.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here, everyone. I'm so grateful for all of you, and we'll see you next week. Jo is teaching, and she has an assignment for you as well, and it's posted online. It's a TED Talk to watch, so look for that. And then Christina Hides is teaching the week after that. So thank you all.
You did a great job, Katie. That was a lot of material to put all together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie.
Have a good night.
Thanks, Katie.
You're welcome.
Bye, everybody.